my name is Vix. Welcome back to this booktube channel called Goddess of Gore, where I like to talk about horror, thriller, sometimes fantasy and occasionally sci-fi books every week. This week is my February wrap-up at last, and I would like to do a quick little rundown of all the books I read in the order that I read them, which were my top 3 books of the month, and what was the biggest surprise. So let's get on with it. On the 3rd of the month I finished The Confession by Jessie Burton. This was my book club pick for February, and honestly it wasn't that bad. Jessie Burton's writing is impeccable and I couldn't stop reading it. It was beautiful. It followed Elise in the 1980s London and California, and Rosie in the 2010s London. Rosie was Elise's daughter, raised by a single parent father, but she just wanted to know the truth about what happened to her mother. Her father flings her a clue one day, like, there's an author who will know what happened to your mother. And her name was Connie, and oh, by the way, she used to be your mother's lover. So off Rosie goes to try and have it out with Connie, and to be one step closer to finding out whether her mother, was still alive and why she left her. Through a series of very unbelievable coincidences, she manages to get up close and personal to the reclusive author, who does not give interviews and has never written another novel since her mother left. There is an actual confession in this book, and that was a brutal and cutthroat outburst that left serious repercussions for everyone involved. Although this wasn't something I would actively seek out to read myself, which I am sure I have mentioned before is the whole reason why I joined my book club, I would recommend it to someone who likes contemporary fiction and that sort of thing. The next book I finished was an audiobook, and that was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, narrated by Ray Porter. I loved this book. What else can I say? It was perfect. It was techie, it was geeky, it was heartwarming, it was tense, it was secretive. It was just perfect. Ray Porter did a fantastic job at bringing the sound of what you would expect an American science teacher to sound like. Almost everyone who has read this book has said how brilliant it was, and it was totally worth the hype. There's even a couple of twists in it that I didn't see coming. And if you don't picture Eva Stratt as Edna Mode from The Incredibles, then there is something seriously wrong with your visual imagery. I finished The Radleys by Matt Haig next, and this was another brilliant book. I haven't read anything from him before, but I do own The Humans and The Midnight Library, which I will probably get around to in October for my anti-spooky month that I do. I'll explain what that's all about closer to the time. We follow a very average middle-class family in an average middle-class street in an average middle-class town, but we soon discover that the parents of this family work hard, very hard, not to be discovered to be vampires. Literally every vampire trope is used in this book, as well as outing every great poet, artist, musician and actor as a secret vampire. Now, this book reminded me of a friend I had back in my early youth. She came from a very well-to-do family. Her father was a GP, just like Peter Radley. Her mother was very highly strung and something of a poodle about her, always impeccably turned out. She was in the WI, the Women's Institute, and ran the local women's pudding club and things like that. Turns out, she wasn't just selling jam and cakes though. Those naughty middle classes have to get their thrills somehow. You just never know what happens behind those Laura Ashley curtains, do you? Nightmare Alley by William Lindsay Gresham was a bit of a letdown, to be honest. I'd have thought if they were re-releasing a vintage book, they would have gotten rid of the racial slurs that littered throughout this book. It really put the dampeners on what was a very clever little book. There's a vintage style of writing which took me a while to get used to, but I found that if I read it in the style of James Stewart, I could get through it easier. Like this here, see? The book chapters, and yes, also the ebook, was started with a gorgeous tarot card with a warning of what was to come in the chapter ahead. It follows the POV of Stan, a guy who thinks he can pretty much do as he pleases to whomever he pleases and get away with it based on his smooth talking and good looks. And he does, treading on everyone he can on his way to the top of his mentalist sham. But you know what they say about being the top of your game? The only way is down. And boy, oh boy, this ending is worth every single struggle I had with this reading. But again, I just wish they had taken out all of the derogatory words before putting it back out. Halfway through the month, I finished book 4 of the Spell Slinger series by Sebastian de Castell on audio, narrated as ever by Joe Jameson. Soulbinder was a much better instalment, and I really enjoyed listening to Kellen try and get his way out of the Ebony Abbey, standing up to his family and accepting his fate and new future. Being all alone made him reflect on just how much his friends have taken the place of his family and how important they all have been to him in the time since he left home. Next was another audiobook that I listened to while waiting for Pine to be available on BorrowBox, and that was Bleed More, Body More, and I had already listened to it and rated it on NetGalley, and I hadn't originally enjoyed it, but the synopsis had sounded so good that I thought I may have judged it too harshly. It turns out I hadn't. It was about a girl named Joey who gets a call to help a friend whose car is stuck in Leakin Park, the town's notorious murder and body dumping ground. So she sets off and picks up the car, but her friend is nowhere to be seen. She gets the car back to the garage where she works, only to find a dead body in the boot. She calls the police, who assume her friend is guilty since he's not there. Joey's like, there's no way he did it. He's not that kind of guy, and sets out to find him and prove his innocence. She finds out way more than that by the end of the book. Maybe you'll like it, but like I said, I've tried it twice now, and nope, not for me. At the same time I was listening to that, I was reading Fragile Earth by Susanna Wise. I could not stop reading this book. Honestly, I couldn't stop thinking about it. All the time I wasn't reading it. This is a dystopian book set in the future sometime after 2030, since that was the only year mentioned in the book in the past tense. A plague has happened, which meant all the bees were killed off, the water supply was contaminated, and meat was tainted and unconsumable. Literally all amenities in this world were government and digitally controlled. So when the whole world tech goes down, so does the electricity, phones, healthcare, internet, gas, water. So no transport, no locks, no money, no power, no water. It follows the lives of Signe and Matthew, parents to their 6-year-old Jed, as their world starts to unravel and they begin packing up for their long journey from London to Signe's mother, who lives in the countryside. I forget where, but I think it was near Wales, since that was mentioned a lot, where they may be able to live a little better off the land. And that's where everything begins to spiral in the story. It gets frantic and you feel the high alert of what Signe is going through. The despair and fraying at the edges that Signe's bottom is falling out of the world comes to life on the pages. Anyone who has ever mislaid something really important, or lost a child in a really busy shopping centre, or deleted your final masterpiece from your computer, thrown away an envelope stuffed with your life savings, knows that feeling of fizzle behind your eyes, the sheer panic of wanting to scream at the top of your lungs and simultaneously roll in a ball and die. The only problem I had with this book was that child Jed. He spoke like one of those "it never happened" of the year awards on Twitter. If you know, then you know. Almost at the end of the month, the 20th, I finished Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This book hurt my head when I would think about it afterwards, but wow, can Blake Crouch write a story. It was so well done, and I honestly haven't gotten the thought of that one scene with the bloody mangled version of Dessen out of my head. It was an absolute thrill ride and I loved every single bit of it. The basic premise of the story is we follow an ordinary guy and his well-loved wife and teenage son who goes out to the pub one evening alone, and on his way home he is drugged and left in a box. Then he has to find his way home. That's it. But if you put that story and get all sci-fi and dark and horrible, then it becomes something else entirely. This is that story. The penultimate book I finished was Pine by Francine Toon, and this was on audio, narrated amazingly by Kathleen McCarran. And at first I didn't like it, but I kept going because it was like I wasn't spending any time reading it, because I was listening to it when I was doing my workouts every day at the same time, and I'm so glad I didn't give up on it. It's not scary, it's atmospheric. It was like seeing something in the corner of your eye, or being in a room that was daylight and you're doing something but now it's dusk and you look up and suddenly you don't know what you're doing and it's dark. It's mostly a story from the perspective of Lauren, a 10-year-old girl raised by her father since her mother mysteriously vanished when she was very small. As the story goes along, it's difficult to remember it's set in the modern day, because at times when the village and its inhabitants are described, I drifted off to the past. It's set in an insular village in a traditional Scotland where everybody knows everyone. It's hard to describe the feeling of dread in the book. You know something is going to go wrong, but when and to who? The shapes and sounds that are seen and heard just in the periphery. I'm really struggling to describe it and do it justice, but it was brilliant. And then, last but obviously not least, was Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I was beginning to struggle with this. I was actively avoiding it because of its wordiness. But I'm glad I saw it through because I can now move on with the next stack of books. Another vampire book, and yes, they were fantastic as expected, but it could have been over so much quicker, like 200 pages quicker. But you know Stephen, he has to go into detail about every single member of the town. And yes, it is good when you think about the book afterwards. But wow, do I really need to know how many lovers Mrs. So-and-so has had? Is this relevant to the story? The vampires were creepy. The inhabitants of the town that the vampires took over made creepy vampires. And yes, I did think it was creepy when I imagined Father Callahan as a vampire in his robes and stuff, with his vampire face and his long vampire fingernails being all vampire-y. I'll admit that. But now, what was my top 3 then? Play the music. In third place for February, it's Salem's Lot. Just picked to the top spot is The Radlets by Matt Haig. And tip top of the tops, number 1, drum roll, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. But what was the biggest surprise of the month? Well, that was Fragile Earth by Susanna Wise. I honestly couldn't believe how much I enjoyed that book. So that's it. February's done and dusted. Thank you so much for watching. Tell me in the comments down below if you've been inspired to read any of these books. And what did you most enjoy out of your February reads? Most of all, pay your library fines, they're overdue. Until next time, bye bye.